just a few announcements. We are recruiting for some new board members. We need some fresh blood to give us some more ideas and stuff, and hopefully bring some exciting programs and speakers and such. Or if you don't want to be on the board and have some suggestions, feel free to let us know because we're always looking for new ideas and people to bring. And thank you, Jeff, for bringing Dani to us. I think she had some really great concepts to
Yeah.
share.
I just wanted to add that we do our board meetings by Zoom, so you do not have to get in your car and drive anywhere.
Very
That is
true.
definitely helpful.
Yeah, that's encouraging to me.
And then if people could chip in on meeting night, we have to sometimes we arrange the tables and they have to put them all back and wipe off the tables and leave it just as way we found it. So if people could help on that, it would be helpful as well. And then seeds, that's a year-long endeavor. Each season ends. Don't forget to collect the seed heads and set them on a paper bag or piece of wax paper or something, but not in a plastic bag because they'll rot rather than dry out. Mary, you want to add anything to
Yeah,
that?
well, just that I have already collected from early spring seeds. They're making them, so why not get them and make them available? So there's never a time that we don't have anything in our garden that might be a useful and interesting thing for somebody else. So it's a wonderful way to contribute, and it's easy and it's fun. So
I have
thank
a small rock garden, Celine, that or Cellini, whatever you want to pronounce it, sitting on some wax paper, and they have the tiniest little seeds. So nobody better
yeah,
sneeze around it, or else I'm in
yeah.
trouble. And then you can give those to Mary at a regular meeting, or save them up, mail them in, or contact
Anyway,
Mary. She'll tell you how to get there.
it's always in the bulletin where to send them.
There you go. Okay, good. And then if anybody would like to, we don't have any coffee in the gardens coming up, but if anybody would like to share their garden, we would love to have that. Usually it's in the morning on a weekend, but it doesn't have to be. We had one that was in the evening that was really very nice. Or if you have a neighbor that would want to, have a really cool garden that they would like to share, we'd like to go see their garden too. Any garden. Next month is Dan Arcos for the Brazilian Society will be in live in person at the San Francisco County Fair building, and we'll be sharing some ideas on what he has some handouts too, which we'll send out by email of what are the best bromeliads that grow outside. I love them because they are great in dry shade. The soil doesn't have to be really wet, but they got the water storage in their little cup there. But and then they'll also have plants for sale, so that should be
Oh, good.
fun. Jeff, do you want to introduce Dani?
Yes. So we found Dani Baker because of my sister. My sister lives in Potsdam, New York, which I always used to think was very close to Canada, being only 22 miles from Canada. But in fact, Dani Baker lives on an island in the St. Lawrence River, and she's only 2 miles from Canada. So she's trumped my sister by a considerable margin. Dani Baker has a book and a PBS TV show that is in 8 episodes that hopefully we can get our local PBS station to pick up. And it is called The Home Scale Forest Garden: How to Plan, Plant, and Tend a Resilient Edible Landscape. And she'll be talking to us tonight about that. I learned about this just for reference from the Watertown Daily News that my sister sent me. And so with that brief introduction, Dani, please take it away.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for inviting me, and we will begin. So just to show you where I'm located, the star is where I live, and I'm about 2 hours southeast of Ottawa. So we're just literally a stone's throw from Canada. This is the island that my farm is on. The base of the windmill is where my farm is located. We have 102 acres, and luckily the island is interstate access, so I don't need a boat to go to and from. I-81 comes to the island and then goes from there into Canada. So we have a pretty diversified organic farm. This was my retirement gig. We started the farm 21 years ago. Um, we have beef cows. We have had goats. We just sold our goat herd last fall after raising them for 18 years. We have some poultry, some ducks and chickens, and we're just raising some turkeys. They're in the living room. They just hatched out this past week. And it's too cold outside. They don't have feathers yet, so they can't be outside yet. We do annual vegetables. And we do tours. This is me touring people through the edible forest. We have a few campsites scattered on our property. We host volunteers year round. We have UPIC in the edible forest, and we've done some events, but not since after COVID. This is a nice amenity that we recently built. It's a two-story cottage suspended among trees in a knoll in the back of our property. And there's a wraparound deck, and this is the downstairs, has all the amenities. It's got a solar array. It's off the grid, but it's got power and heat. This is the upstairs, and it's on Airbnb if anybody's interested. So 7 years into the farm, I took a 2-hour class at the local cooperative extension called permaculture, and I'd never even heard the word before. I didn't know what it was, but the concepts made so much sense to me that I decided there and then I was going to plant an edible forest. And I came home and I told my partner, Dave, we need a fence because we have a lot of deer pressure on the island. And he built me a fence around about half an acre, and that was the beginning. So just some shots of different seasons. So this is late spring. Peonies are edible, by the way. You may not know that. The flowers are. This is a little later, early summer. The cherries are ripe and the daylilies are blooming. They're edible as well. A little later, this is an apricot tree and some black-eyed Susans that just moved in. A little later, some wild plants that moved in around my pond. So I have some goldenrod, some Joe Pye weed, and other stuff. And fall and winter. So we had a zone 4 winter this year. It got to minus 25. So today, what I hope is that you all will take home some tips on how to sustainably maximize water conservation and solar collection, build in plant nutrient sources, manage pests and disease, minimize human labor going forward, integrate aesthetic appeal, and learn about some native and non-native perennial plants to incorporate in a resilient edible landscape. So this kind of planting, first of all, it's all perennials, almost all food producing plants, and it's modeled after a forest edge. So I'm not sure how a forest edge looks in California, but in the East, where the light comes in on the edge of a forest, you have all the layers. You have tall trees, shorter trees, bushes, you have herbaceous plants, ground cover, you even have vines curling up where there's lots of light. So it's modeled after that, all the layers, but also in nature, in a forest, nobody sprays for pests, nobody mulches, nobody fertilizes, nobody cultivates. Nature takes care of all of that. And so when you create a garden like this, you try to build in the things that are in nature that provide all those services into your garden. So your labor is going to be reduced as time goes on. And I'm going to talk more about that in detail as we proceed. So if you're interested in planting a garden like this, you need to study your land through all the seasons and make a 2-scale drawing with notes. And I'll just show you a couple of examples. So the kinds of things you want to look for are the slopes, the nature of the slopes, which direction they face, if there's any standing water. When you have your rainy season in the winter, is there any water flowing into your property? Where does it come from? Where does it end up? What's the prevailing wind and how strong is it? Are there any structures? So this is the second half acre of my garden where there were some trees that I didn't take down. So there weren't any man-made structures, but there were definitely some trees. And there was also the water table was very interesting. The water table was at or above the surface of the ground in half of the space, but we could still see the different slopes and just you want to just do a sketch. These are not to scale, but eventually you want to do a 2-scale drawing. So when you decide where you're placing your plants, you can place them appropriately so that they have enough room to grow. This is a really small group, so I had told Jeff that I wanted questions at the end, but if you have some pressing questions as I go through this, please, I'd like to entertain them, okay? So there's several principles that are incorporated in a garden like this. And an important one is conserving water. So there's various ways that you can do this. And I know you have a dry season. Jeff asked me to gear this toward a Mediterranean climate, which I have no experience with except wandering around the Greek island of Milos and seeing their plants there. But other than that, I've not grown anything in a Mediterranean climate. But conserving water, I'm sure, is very important there because you have an extensive dry season. So here are some ways to do it, and I'll get into each. So the more layers you have in the vertical space, the more foliage you have. And it provides shade to conserve moisture in the ground. When the leaves fall, they provide more mulch that also conserves moisture. And when the nights are cool and the temperature gets below the dew point, dew will condense on the leaves. The more leaves you have, the more condensed dew. And the leaves will absorb some of that water directly, but if there's enough of it, it'll fall to the ground and be absorbed by the ground. So again, the more vertical layers you have, the more foliage, the more dew is absorbed. And also, of course, they provide shade when they're in leaf. So you also want to keep the ground covered. Ideally with something living, but definitely some kind of organic matter. So on the upper left, there's some clover growing. Here, there's strawberries that are naturally covering the ground. Ponds, if you can create them to collect some of the water that comes when you have rain, and hugelkultur mounds. So I'm going to, are you familiar with hugelkultur mounds? Somewhat. Not, well, they're a great way to conserve water. You start with wood. It can be branches, it can be logs. You want to pack them pretty close together. So you don't want mice to get in there and make little homes and then eat your plants from below. But after you have your base of wood, you cover it with all kinds of organic matter, whatever you have handy. Dry leaves, some green stuff, reeds, leftover stuff from an annual vegetable garden. If you have like vines, whatever, just throw it all on there. And then I like to top it with wood chips because they don't have any weed seeds in them, and they hold down some of the other stuff. And then I like to plant them I like to create them in the fall so that the fall rains and the winter snow melt will start decay, and usually I can start planting the next spring. And on top, you can make them any size and essentially any shape, but you want to make them convex because if you make them concave, they'll erode and they won't hold together. So you want the top to be rounded, but they can be any size, and you can plant trees, bushes, anything on top of them. The wood gradually decays and provides organic matter to the mound, but also it acts as a water sink. So it'll hold water that flows into the mound, but also it actually will pull water up from the ground. So in a drought time, the roots of the plants on top of the mound can reach that source of water. And there's just upper right, I just built like 10 mounds in the woods where I have a really high water table. So it got me above the water and also above the root competition of all those trees. And that's just a scene of those mounds in the winter before I planted. So if you have an opportunity to dig a pond, that would be an ideal thing to conserve water. But also, I'm going to go back to that other slide. Collecting water off your roofs would be, and even possibly using your gray water and holding that somehow so you can use it during the dry season would be advantageous. The second principle is maximizing solar collection. Of course, the sun is the source of energy that fuels photosynthesis and makes plants grow and fruit ripen. So there's some strategies for that. Planting sun lovers and full sun, shade lovers and shade. I mean, that's kind of obvious to any gardener. But tallest trees plants to the north, so they're not shading the rest of the garden. Windbreaks to stop the wind and preserve heat. So when you studied your land and you figured out where your wind was coming from and how strong it was, you might decide you need to put a windbreak in there to slow the wind down so that your plants aren't affected. Layer plants to use all the vertical space, and we talked about the different layers. And then you might want some overstory trees to provide shade in the summer. In the tropics, they do that. And I'm really not that familiar with your climate, but if that's important, then that's something you might want to do. So these are just some pictures of my tallest trees to the north. These are black locusts that were on a northwest edge of my garden. And then on the northeast edge. And then in the northwest, I have a couple. And then this was a natural windbreak or hedgerow that existed before I planted my garden. And it was on the northwest side as well. So it wasn't shading the garden. And then here's some examples of windbreaks. So this is a planted windbreak. And this was the existing hedgerow that was on the northwest side of the garden, using all the vertical space. So you maximize your solar collection when you use all the vertical space. So these are tall trees in the background, shorter trees, bushes, herbaceous, ground cover, etc. So I know that in California, fire is a big problem. So I just put this slide together. Some things you can do to protect your house and your garden from fire. So I'm assuming you would know what direction the fire might be coming from if it was going to come. So these are just some strategies. Ponds, stone walls, roads, clear areas. If you have animals, grazing animals that keep the vegetation short, that's helpful. Fire suppressing vegetation like olive, cork, prickly pear, aloe, yucca, barberry, and some of the herbs that don't burn very easily, like rosemary, lavender, and sage. I know that cork doesn't burn because I think it was in elementary school or junior high. I did a paper on Portugal, and that's where they grow cork, and it's the bark of the tree, and it just doesn't burn. So they harvest it about every 10 years. Okay, so to create a self-sustaining garden, you want to build in all the nutrients and pest protection that your food plants require. So this would include nitrogen fixing plants, nutrient accumulating plants, beneficial insect attracting plants, and aromatic pest confusers. So I'm going to talk about each one. So, when you were discussing the various plants you were growing, they were mostly not native, but I thought you might be interested in what would be native. So these are some native nitrogen fixers for all layers that you can scatter around your garden. The amount of nitrogen that's converted into a foreign plants can use is basically proportional to the size of the canopy of a tree or a bush. And there's a formula in my book how to figure that out, how much you need. But the first slide is locust, black locust, which has an edible flower, but also there's a cultivar called purple robe locust, which has lovely pinkish purple flowers. It's in the same family. So both of those are tall trees that fixed nitrogen. This is a buffalo berry. And by the way, I chose trees that are all very drought tolerant, or plants. So buffalo berry, very drought tolerant. Another native that not quite as large, maybe 10 feet tall, that fixes nitrogen. This is actually licorice. It's a herbaceous suckering plant that is a legume. So it is a nitrogen fixer. And of course, the root is the part that is used for flavoring, but that's quite drought tolerant. Of course, blue lupin. On the lower left is redbud, which I'm going to talk about a little more later, but it is a nitrogen fixing plant, maybe 30 feet by 30. This is northern bay, but I know you have a bayberry that's acclimated to your climate. Also drought tolerant. False indigo. Now, interestingly enough, I have a quote, California false indigo in my garden. So I know it's native. There's a variety that's native to California. It'll be a bush, maybe 10 or 12 by 12. Beautiful spikes of purple flowers that you can use for dye. It doesn't have any edible parts for people, but the butterflies love the flowers, and fixes nitrogen. And then finally, this is ground nut, which is a herbaceous perennial, which has a tuber underground that's edible. So those are all potential nitrogen fixers. There's many more. I'm sure if you did your own research, you could find many more that might be native, but also non-native nitrogen fixers that you could incorporate. And then of course, nitrogen after water. Nitrogen is a nutrient that plants need the largest quantity of, but then there are many others, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, all those, and many micronutrients. So you want to build in nutrient accumulating plants as well as the nitrogen fixers. So these are plants that generally have a pretty deep taproot that are pulling up nutrients from the subsoil that some other plants' roots are more shallow and they just can't reach. So the one on the left is comfrey. It's Russian comfrey. It's a sterile comfrey. If you plant comfrey, you don't want the kind that produce seeds because it'll spread all over. You won't be able to get rid of it. It'll just take over your space. But this has sterile flowers, doesn't produce seeds, but it concentrates 6 different nutrients in its leaves, and it produces a huge amount of organic matter over the course of a season. And you can cut and drop it where you think a plant needs an extra boost, or you can just let it die down in its place, and the fungal life underground will move the nutrients to where they're needed. Dandelions accumulate many nutrients too, and they're pretty common. Some trees do. This is the purple robe locust again. And in addition to converting nitrogen to a form plants can use, it also concentrates, I believe, potassium and calcium in its leaves. And so when those leaves fall, they spread those nutrients all around the garden. This is a vetch, a hairy vetch. And then down here, I believe, is garden sorrel, which is also a nutrient accumulator. Most herbs are nutrient accumulators. So you want to interplant your nutrient accumulators around your garden so they're providing those extra nutrients to all the plants that may not be able to reach them directly. And then attracting pollinators. So if you have fruit trees or berry bushes that need pollination, you want to have your pollinators around so that they can do that work when your plants are in bloom. So the way to assure that is to have things blooming from as early in the season continuously to as late in the season as possible, so your pollinators will be around to do the work that you want them to do. This is a cornelian cherry. It blooms very, very early. And then the crocuses, of course, and then your fruit trees. And then this is borage or borage that blooms continuously throughout the growing season. It's a self-seeding annual, but it also seems to tolerate frost. So it'll bloom quite late in the season. And of course, the wildflowers, like in the lower right, that we have New England asters and goldenrod, and I believe this is blue vervain. They're all very beneficial for pollinators. The bottom row all have smaller flowers, and they're really useful for beneficial insects, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a future slide. So you have your pollinators, you have your beneficial insects, and then you have your aromatic pest confusers. Now, there's no, I don't think there are any scientific studies that prove that these are useful, but the theory is that if you have herbs and alliums growing scattered around your garden that are quite odoriferous, if a pest comes into the garden, let's say looking for an apple tree, for example, and encounters a mass of lavender, all of a sudden it's going to be kind of overwhelmed with that odor. And where's the apple tree? You can't find the apple tree. So this is lavender. This is sweet cicely. This is oregano. I think this is anise hyssop, chamomile. I can't see what that is. And these are alliums. So the Egyptian walking onion, which is a perennial onion, and these are garlic chives. They're just examples of aromatic pest confusers. So managing pests is always problematic. So there are a bunch of strategies we use to do that. Maximizing diversity in all layers, protecting trunks, attracting predatory insects, attracting pest-eating animals, including trap crops, herbs and alliums, which we just talked about, and excluding deer. So this is just an example of a diverse ground cover. So everything's mixed up. We have strawberries, we have blue flax, we have some lupin and some echinacea all together in the ground layer. And for every layer, you want to maximize your diversity. So you don't want a whole stand of a certain kind of fruit tree together. You want to mix them up, you know, a persimmon here, a pear there, a pomegranate there. So you're trying to mix them up to make it more difficult for the pests to find their hosts, and also for disease spread. If you have a lot of diversity, it's a lot more difficult for disease to move from plant to plant. So this is what happens under the snow if our trunks are not protected. The voles and the mice have nothing else to eat except the bark of my young saplings. So the first year I didn't get around to putting these hardware cloth guards around my trunks, and this is what happened. So I learned really quickly to put them around the day I plant the tree. So that helps for us under the snow. And even, you know, if there's no snow, if it's tall enough, it'll keep your rodents from chewing on the bark. This is an example of a trap crop. So the rose hips are a favorite of chipmunks, and they even prefer them. This is a chipmunk table, by the way, where they've eaten the rose hips. They're even preferred above things like plums that might be ripe at the same time. So if you know what trap crops you can incorporate, or actually, I just discovered this by accident, but if you consciously incorporate some trap crops that are less desirable to you, but more desirable to your pests, then you can avert some problems. Attracting birds. So I have scattered bird houses about my garden. For those that like to nest in a birdhouse, birds eat bugs, and especially in spring when they're feeding their young, they eat a lot of caterpillars, and caterpillars are real pests for your plants. So having a lot of birds around by incorporating nest boxes, but also birds like what's called a bumpy landscape. So different birds will forage at different levels of the canopy, and they'll nest at different levels of the canopy. So if you have a bumpy landscape, which means you're going to have all different levels and open areas as well, but they're all mixed up. You're not going to just have an area where you have bushes and then an area where you have trees. They'll be all mixed up together. That's the best kind of environment to attract the maximum number of birds. And you know, having bushes that are dense that birds like to nest in is also nice. So attracting birds, now that not only do they eat pests, but they also fertilize, but they do like some berries. So especially where I am, The berries that are blue early in the season are the ones that seem most attractive. So I do find I have to net what I grow honeyberries, which are like blueberries, but they're a little earlier. Anyway, I net the berries that I know the birds are going to want to eat. But other than that, they're not much of a problem. Elderberry is actually a trap crop for birds. So I've noticed that they prefer the elderberries to grapes that might be ripe at the same time. So if I have some elderberries nearby, the birds will eat those, which are not, I have plenty of elderberries, so they're not as desirable to me as my grapes. Here's another trap crop. It's a thimbleberry. So it's a native bramble that has an edible berry. And I noticed that the Japanese beetles prefer that to my raspberries. So that's just an example of another trap crop. Having a water feature, it doesn't have to be a big pond. It can just be a small area, but that attracts frogs and dragonflies and maybe some turtles or snakes is really nice to have because they also will help control your pests. And I don't know, oh, spiders. Want to attract spiders as well. So I'm going to show you some, these are examples of some beneficial insects that will eat your pests. And this is my favorite. This is a parasitic wasp, and this is very much magnified. They're only about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch long. And when they're ready to lay their eggs, they lay them on or inside soft skinned pests like caterpillars. So they're very small, so they need very tiny flowers for their nectar and pollen. So this is an elderberry flower. This is all the herbs have small flowers. This is oregano. This is yarrow. The whole daisy family, daisies and asters are great. And the carrot family, I think this is fennel. Those are all wonderful plants for all your beneficial insects, but particularly your parasitic wasp. So if you have these kinds of plants scattered about, your wasps will be around, and when they're ready to lay their eggs, they'll find a pest to lay them on. And spider habitat, spiders tend to like, big leaf plants like rhubarb or hosta, or this is a comfrey plant, or even piles of rocks or piles of wood. So if you have those things around, you can attract spiders that, will basically eat anything they can kill. And then for deer, a really good electrified fence will be that you bait with peanut butter sandwiches. I don't know if you guys have problems with deer, but that worked in 1/2 acre of mine. This did not work over the long haul. This second half-acre garden intersected a deer run where generations of deer have walked. So I wasn't really that successful. So I built these upside down tomato cages. So it's a tomato cage turned upside down and anchored with garden staples on the bottom and then wrapped with chicken wire. And once you can't really see the top of it, but once the seedling, this I use for trees where deer can get to them. Once the tree grows above the chicken wire, then it's taller than a deer can reach, and I can take this off and use it on a different plant. So we just talked about how you're going to build in all the things that nature provides to take care of your pests and provide nutrients. And now we're going to talk about how to minimize human labor going forward.
Quick question, Dani.
Yes.
Back to the deer one about the peanut butter
Oh, yeah,
sandwiches.
good. So if you have an electric fence, first you turn off the power. Then you take aluminum foil and a little dab of peanut butter and wrap it around the fence and clip it with a wooden clothespin. And when the deer come at night, they smell the peanut butter, they touch it with their nose, and they get a shock. And I did this spring and fall for 2 years. And I've never had a problem with deer coming into that garden. And the fence is not that tall. They could easily hop over. But I trained 2 generations of deer essentially to avoid it. So
training system. I get it. Thank
yep.
you.
Oh, thanks for the question.
Yep.
So mulch naturally, trees for trellises, build an axis and edge, and matching plants with preferred habitat. That comes up a lot. Of you guys are all gardeners, so you know if you put your plant in a habitat that's to its liking, you're not going to have to do much. It'll take care of itself and it'll be happy. So that's a way to minimize your labor. If you study your plants and study your habitat and do the good matches. So we had animals, so we used animals to prepare our soil, but if you don't have animals, doesn't matter. Chickens are helpful. They do eat bugs and weed seeds, but they also scratch up mulch. And I haven't used chickens for that reason. Um, Letting gravity help. So if whenever you can move your weight downhill, that's preferable. So we had a large quantity of semi-composted yard waste that was delivered to us, and I had them dump it at the top of the hill. So this is the very beginning when I think the first year when I just planted a few things in the garden, and the soil was bare. The pigs did that job. But anyway, so whenever I had to move this mulch to create a bed, I was moving it downhill. If you have an opportunity to create a pond at the top of your property, that's another way to use gravity to move the water down. Or even if you're carrying it in buckets, at least you're walking downhill instead of uphill. All right. We had heavy clay in our garden, and your land may or may not be perfect for plants when you start developing your garden. So cover crops are a great low labor way to improve the soil. So I think for you, you would want to throw them on the ground, throw your seed on the ground just before your rainy season. So the rain would help moisten the ground and make germination positive. Where I am, we do what's called frost seeding. So in late winter, early spring, I I had a bunch of old clover seeds, 3 different varieties, and I know clover has a really deep taproot to open up my heavy clay to allow some air and some water to penetrate better. So I just threw the seeds on the garden, and you can see that it's already, even though we had a little snow afterwards, the clovers already started to germinate. And they did a fabulous job. Within a year, before the clover actually did its work, when I dug to plant a tree, it was like the soil I dug up was like potting clay. I mean, I could throw a pot. It was so dense. And after a year, it had broken up into maybe half an inch pieces. The roots of the clover did that. So it was much better for my fruit trees and so on to penetrate with their roots. Um, I don't know how familiar you are with cover crops, but there's a large variety and each type of plant does a different job. So if you decide what you need to improve your soil, you can find a cover crop or a combination of cover crops to do that job. Providing mulch naturally. So I mentioned earlier that the more foliage you have, the more natural mulch falls on the garden. And as your garden matures, it'll be self-mulching, just like a forest. But in the interim, I do use a bunch of wood chips and some, leaves as well. But here's some examples of some ground covers that provide mulch coming in. So this is, oops, sorry, go back. This is ground ivy. Now, it's considered to be invasive, but in a garden like mine, it's very beneficial because it moves in by itself. And by the way, I think it's hardy to zone 11. It moves in by itself. It covers the ground, so it keeps the ground, covered and more moist underneath and cooler. The flowers are very attractive to pollinators, and the leaves are actually edible. In England, they make an herb butter using these leaves. So when it decides to move in, I'm happy because it's covering the ground and I don't have to plant anything. And then these also are wild strawberries that like to come in and cover the ground, which I'm very grateful for, and they produce really nice flowers and fruit. This is a comfrey plant. which naturally mulches the ground because it decays very rapidly in place. But like I mentioned before, you can cut and drop it next to whatever plant you think can benefit from the extra nutrients. So using trees for trellises is another labor-saving device. So this is an Asian pear tree that I planted a sprawling blackberry to the south of, just to the south of it, and used the tree for a trellis. This is a black locust with a vine growing up it. And this is was a wild pear that I left. I didn't cut it down. I left it in the garden. And there's a wisteria growing up it. Wisteria is also a nitrogen fixer. So if you're just doing a foundation planting, which you can do with this, you can plant all edibles around your foundation and, have an edible forest garden. But if you have a larger plot that you want to develop, it's really important to plan your access in at the beginning. So my partner, Dave, insisted that I have a 10-foot wide access road in each of my gardens. And I argued with him at first, but then I said, okay, fine. Because he said, hey, if I have to, run a tractor in there, I'm going to need 10 feet wide. And I was really grateful in the end that he had insisted, because my neighbor was dredging out a pond and had all this muck dirt that he wanted to give me. And he had a little dump truck. And if it weren't for this 10-foot wide access road, he couldn't have driven the truck in and dumped it right where I needed the soil. I would have had to cart it with a wheelbarrow over a hill and hundreds of wheelbarrows, because he actually dumped 4 loads that he was able to access with my 10-foot wide road. So 10 feet for a vehicle, 6 feet for a golf cart, 3 or 4 feet for like a wheelbarrow or, a walking path. Those are the dimensions you need to kind of build in. And you also want to build in, using your pathways, a lot of edge. So this kind of garden, you're not creating a dense woods where underneath there's so little light that very few things can grow. Like a forest edge, you want to create a lot of edge so the light can come in from all sides and you have more options in terms of plants. So this is just an example. There's 3 beds here, 1, 2, and 3, and there's about a 6-foot wide access road, path to get to them, but also that creates a lot of edge. This is an old farmer's trick. It's called a corduroy road. If you have an area that's underwater for part of the year and you want to have access through it, you take logs, maybe usually about 4 inches in diameter, but they can be bigger. And the width that you need, if it's going to be for a tractor, 10 feet, for a golf cart, 6 feet, you lay them tight to each other, perpendicular to the line of travel, and they provide a hard surface. So even if there's standing water above them, you're going to have a hard surface. You're not going to sink in the mud with your boots or with your vehicle. And eventually the sod will grow up around them and cut off the oxygen, so they actually don't rot very fast. These will basically be preserved for about 10 years before you have to replace or repair them. So it's a really good way to create access in a wet area, even if it's just seasonally wet. So the final point in terms of reducing human labor is matching plants with their ideal habitats. The better you match your plants, the less work you're going to have to do taking care of them and also protecting them from pests. So grapes, for example, are very prone to fungal disease. So the best place to place a grapevine is in a southeast exposure so that the sun hits it first thing in the morning and dries it. The other thing grapes like is really good air circulation. Again, to combat potential fungal disease. The second slide is there are some trees that are actually understory germinators. A lot of your nut trees are, and this is a pine nut. that needs shade in its formative stage. So I just built shade. You can either plant them in the shade if you have it, but I didn't. So I actually built shade out of pallet um, slabs. So I just hammered them in the garden with the tallest one to the south and graduating them around. And when the tree reached about 3 feet, which was as tall as these pallet slabs were, um, it was tall enough that it didn't need them anymore. So I use this for pawpaw, for the pine, and even for, I have some northern pecans that I'm sheltering because I've learned that they do really prefer shade for their formative years. So that's another thing to consider. The upper right is some cherry trees. Now, cherry trees like really good drainage. So I put them on the top of the hill, which was the best drainage I had. And then down here are shade lovers. So these are red currants that really like shade, particularly in the afternoon. And here they're placed under in the shade of an apricot tree. So just matching plants with their ideal habitat. Another consideration is, do they like a lot of moisture? We'll plant them in a really wet spot. Do they like it high and dry with good drainage? Put them on a south-facing slope. So this is a south-facing slope. And these just some examples of plants that really like the good drainage and are very drought tolerant. So lavender, the peach really likes good drainage. Juniper is very drought tolerant. The lupin, I already mentioned. Siberian pea shrub is a nitrogen fixer that really likes it high and dry, has edible flowers and pods. Sea kale is a perennial vegetable that likes it, likes really good drainage. And what else do I have here? Oh, the I can't see it, but it's fennel also is really likes good drainage. So these are just some examples. You might be able to substitute an Asian persimmon for an American persimmon in this collection. And you can see all the diversity I have here. And I have, I've incorporated nitrogen fixers and also nutrient accumulators, et cetera, et cetera. So San Francisco, where are you? I wanted to show the new USDA map of the hardiness zones. I thought that your organization covered the entire state of California. So this is Northern California, where I think most of you are located. I was in San Francisco in 1970, and I remember it was very foggy. And the fog would curl over the little hills around it. Yeah. Okay.
Definitely has that
Still true.
reputation.
I think looking at this year, maybe a 9B.
San Francisco is 10A and 10B,
Okay.
but a lot of our members are in the East Bay and North Bay. So we cover Oakland, as you can see on the map, up into Napa, possibly even to Santa Rosa. And these are the areas where we get the more classical Mediterranean climates, where it's hot in the summer and mild but wet in the winter.
Right. Okay. So, and then Southern California, none of your members are here, I take it.
No.
No. Okay. So, these are some native food plants for the landscape that I'm familiar with that are good to zone 9 anyway. Maybe some of you are in a zone 9. Grapes, if you know the varieties that grow well for you, can be up to a 10. But I'm just going to go over these quickly because if you're 10, 10A and B, you really need to see my other slides. But anyway, honey locust is a great nitrogen fixer. I trim it up to 30 feet if I have to, and I grow fruit plants underneath. So this is a sweet cherry, and the pods of the honey locust actually are edible. Inside, there's a viscous substance that's very sweet that you can eat. I think it's a wonderful tree for the overstory because it has an open canopy, so it can let a lot of light in, and yet it's providing that nitrogen fixing function. And the canopy in a mature honey locust can be 45 feet wide. So that's a lot of fixing of nitrogen. The red bud is good to zone I think when I was doing research for this presentation, I found a couple of nurseries that actually have red buds that are more drought tolerant than others. So if you wanted to plant one of these, you could do your research and find a more drought tolerant one. But these are all drought. I chose all of these plants that I chose to talk about are relatively drought tolerant.
We
It
do
has
have a
beautiful,
native red bud.
Yeah.
pardon me?
We do have a native red
Oh,
bud.
lovely. Okay. So the flowers are edible, as are the pods. When they're green like this, they're like Chinese pea pods. So you can eat all those. It fixes nitrogen. It's a beautiful tree. The heart-shaped leaves start out red and they turn green and then yellow in the fall. Just a gorgeous tree. It'll grow to be maybe 30 by 30. And even when it's without leaves, the vase-like form of the trunk and branches is really attractive.
I just wanted to add, I
Yeah.
belong to the National Arbor Foundation, and one year they sent me 10 Eastern redbuds. And I didn't know what to do with them because I didn't need 10 trees. And my friend said, just go stick them around the yard and see what happens. And one of them actually outperforms our Western redbud. Gets absolutely no summer water,
Hmm.
and
Perfect.
it doesn't get our Western redbuds don't like the hot inland area as much because they're actually from the mountains. But this eastern redbud, it's canadensis, is just really amazing. But I did not know it was edible because I've been
Yes,
harvesting
the
the
flowers are. And in fact, I was giving a talk in Northern Virginia, and one of the women there said, "Oh, you can dehydrate them and you can put some confectionery sugar on them and put them in a jar and sell them like a confection." And I asked her, "Do they keep their color when they're dehydrated?" And she said, "Yes."
Hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting. But yeah, the flowers they taste like, sweet peas because it's a legume. Um, so thank you for adding that. That's really great to hear. And you can group them. They don't like wet feet and they don't like a lot of wind, but you can group them. They're very attractive in the landscape, however you use them, or as a specimen tree. Hazelnut. So these are very drought tolerant. They form a great windbreak hedge. The nuts are edible. They're in the birch family, so they have these catkins that turn yellow, yellowish when they're ripe and very early. And the only issue with the hazelnuts is the rodents like them better than us. So the rodents will come eat them, chipmunks, squirrels, before they're really ripe. But I found that the rodent population, has its peak and then it has its trough. So on the years when there's aren't a lot of rodents, I get to have the nuts. So that's what I have to say about that. The red mulberry is native. There's black and white mulberries as well, but the red mulberry is native and delicious berries. And not everybody knows that you can eat the leaves of the mulberry. So you can pollard a mulberry, and so that the fresh leaves on the new branches are easy to reach. And you can, most people cook them, but they're quite edible and the fruit is great. And this is just a weeping mulberry. I'm not sure what the variety is, but it's growing for me. So it doesn't take up very much space. A regular
So
mulberry,
the mulberry leaves. Do you harvest them when they first come out, or do you
yeah, fresh, the young leaves. That's why if you pollard it, and you have new branches with fresh young leaves that you can reach, if it's
right?
hard to reach, it's going to be a tree is maybe 40 by 40 when it's mature. So it's hard to reach the fresh leaves on that. Um, the only caution with the mulberry, a couple of things. When the berries drop, they're pretty messy, so you don't want to plant it near a walkway or someplace where you don't want a mess on the ground. And also, the roots are very invasive, so you don't want it near a septic system.
You're talking about the native one. I'm growing a lot of the hybrids that make the long mulberries, and
Oh,
they're in the fig family, I found out. So
oh,
they have a lot of the properties of figs, which are an antifungal for people.
oh.
And but they have another side effect for me, unfortunately. But they make a great syrup, and I use it in making a salad dressing.
Thank you. American plum There are lots of native plums. I'm familiar with this one. It's a thorny tree, but it's only 15 by 15. I don't prune it. Beautiful flowers in the spring. Has a reliable crop every year, which is not as prone to pests as my European plums or my American Asian crosses. The fruit is maybe an inch or an inch and a quarter across. The flesh gets super sweet. The skin stays tart and pretty colors in the fall. It's drought tolerant, allegedly, but they use it actually to hold riverbanks because it can take rising water for a period of time. But my research said it was drought tolerant, so I'm telling you. Juneberry. Okay, this is also known as serviceberry. Um, there's a there's a variety of this in every state but Hawaii. So I'm sure there are some native to California. Beautiful flowers early, and then a fruit somewhat like a blueberry. The birds love them. There's some cultivars that have been developed for bigger fruit, for harvesting. Very drought tolerant. Here are some wild Juneberry trees that are growing on top of a rocky ridge on my property. So they've got to be pretty drought. You can see the rock. They must be pretty drought tolerant to be growing there. So, and pretty colors in the fall. So that's another edible native. And of course, grapes, which you would know which grapes grow where you are.
Almost all of them.
And finally, the sunchoke, which I already talked about a little bit. Um, it's a native tuber. It's in the sunflower family. It's a herbaceous perennial. The tubers, there are many varieties. This just happens to be my variety. Very versatile food. I've used them instead of potatoes and frittatas. I've used them instead of like Chinese chestnuts in a stir fry. I've sliced them thin and fried them, and they make a really tasty potato chip. Um, and it's like, you harvest them. Once the plants go dormant, probably for you in midwinter, and you'll never find them all, so they'll come back. Um, and the only issue with them is they do like to move. So if you plant them, and they're quite tall, so they're going to be like 10 or 12 feet tall, and they flower late in the season. So you don't want to put them to the south of something that doesn't want shade, but and they also will move. So I control mine just by mowing. So the patches of these I have, I just mow around to keep them where I want them. So again, I wanted to gear this toward a Mediterranean climate. So here are some edible succulents that you can plant, and you can see they all go up to 11. So if you're a 10A or B, these should grow for you. And I'm not familiar with them, but these are all edibles. I am familiar with purslane. It grows in my garden. Just as a weed, but I leave it because it covers the ground. It starts later in the season where I am, and the leaves, this is purslane picture. Um, it's the leaves are edible.
Hmm.
I've eaten it. I got Italian purslane because the leaves are bigger
Uh-huh. Okay.
and it
So
just grows like a weed. So
exactly. Yeah. But it covers the ground, you don't have to plant it. So here's some drought tolerant fruit trees that are zone 10 or 11 or even 12, except for Asian persimmon, that's only a 9, but some of you might be able to grow it. Um, one factoid I didn't mention is when you're studying your land and you're looking at the slopes, every degree of south facing slope gives you 2 additional growing days. Every degree of north facing slope, you lose 2 growing days. So if you want to grow an Asian persimmon and you're in a 10, maybe you have a north facing slope that you can put that persimmon on where it be a little cooler and a little shorter season. Mango, lemon, how do you pronounce that? Jujube or jujube?
jujube. There used to be a candy called jujubes.
Oh, well, it has a pretty big range, 6 to 11. So I might, if we get, we're a 5 now, if we get to be a 6, I might try to grow it. Custard apple and date palm. So they're all drought tolerant fruit trees that you can put in your edible forest, and drought tolerant herbs and perennial vegetables. So thyme, rosemary, lavender, oregano, sage, bay, chamomile, chives, and garlic chives are all drought tolerant. The chives and the garlic chives will just go dormant when it's dry. And then when you have your rain, they'll come back. I'm familiar with that here because sometimes we have pretty dry summers. Um, and then sunchoke, we already talked about. Turkish rocket, fennel, globe artichoke, asparagus actually is good to zone 11. That surprised me. Nasturtium, which is actually perennial in zone 10 or 11. It's annual for me. Groundnut and hyacinth bean.
Groundnut
So,
is intriguing to me because I don't know if we have any sources out here for groundnut.
hmm. Well, I know there's a number of nurseries in the country that offer them, so you could try them. Yeah, and hyacinth bean, you do have to process, but the flowers are edible, the pods are edible, and the beans are edible. It's a staple in Africa, and they're beautiful plants. If you're not familiar with them, they have like a magenta underleaf and a magenta pod and magenta flowers. They're really lovely. Okay, I guess that's the end of my presentation. So this is my book. And I think the book would be very relevant to you if you're interested in doing this kind of planting. And about half the plants I talk about are at least good to zone 9 in this book. And then that's about my TV show. If you're interested in having your local station schedule it, you could just call them up and request it. And it will be available for national distribution the 1st of next month. But stations usually schedule out 2 or 3 months ahead of time. So you could call them now. And here's some references. So I'm going to leave this screen up for a little bit, or for the rest of the time. So Bill Mollison, Introduction to Permaculture. The cool thing about this book is he talks about temperate climates, arid climates, and tropical climates. So, and he talks about a lot of different things you can do in each of those different climates to incorporate the principles of permaculture. So that would be a good one. Martin Crawford, this is one of my Bibles, Creating a Forest Garden. He's the fellow in England who has probably a 35-year-old now edible forest in his institute in southwest England. Hemingway, A Gaia's Garden, A Guide to Home-Scale Permaculture. So he describes creating a permaculture garden in the desert of New Mexico. And also, I know he has a section talking about some California gardens as well. Sepp Holzer has a permaculture farm on 140 hectares in the mountains of Austria. And he has a lot of really cool ideas. This is another Bible, this 2-volume temperate climate permaculture. I don't know if it would really, some things would be relevant for you, especially in volume 2. The tables in the back are just so complete. Anything you ever want to know are in these tables in great detail, including things like, birds and where they forage and where they nest and all. Anyway, speaking of birds, there's a really cool organization that's actually centered in California. It's called the Wild Farm Alliance, and they have a lot of good information about how to attract birds to your property. Tolmeyer Eric, Perennial Vegetables. So this is a cool book because for every perennial vegetable, and he covers tropical, arid, as well as temperate, he has a map of the United States, actually a map of the Western Hemisphere, and he shows you exactly where that vegetable can grow. So that's very useful. And then Lee Reich has landscaping with fruit. So he has detailed descriptions of a lot of different fruiting plants, and then, of course, my book. So that's the end of my presentation. I would be happy to entertain any questions you have, and remaining questions or comments.
I have a question, Dani.
Yes.
But at the beginning, you mentioned that your property has areas that are either like flush with the water table or even sometimes below the water table. How did you handle that? And have you been able to change that
Yeah.
in any way?
Well, I've built hugelkultur mounds to raise the planting above that. I've also planted very plants that are very tolerant of that saturated ground. And there's a number of them. I didn't put the slide in this presentation. I have a sketch of a garden with all these plants that love the wet ground. I didn't put it in because I didn't think that would be a problem of yours. But there's a lot of plants that really like it wet. Tamarack, well, that won't grow where you are. It's only to zone 6. But high bush cranberry, and actually the northern bay, I don't know about your bay, but the northern bay likes it wet. Aronia likes it wet. The American plum can tolerate the wet ground because I have some growing in that area. I've also used I've sheet mulched numerous times to raise the level. I've also tried cover cropping because that adds organic matter and to raise the level of the ground. And mostly just trying to match. Marshmallow is an edible plant that loves it wet. So just trying. There's an edible ground cover called water celery that loves it wet. There's a Southeast Asian plant called hatunyai or hot tuna that's considered invasive, but it's edible and it really likes warm weather, which likes the wet ground. So there's lots of ways to do it, but mostly in the end, matching the plants to their ideal habitat, putting plants that like it wet where it's wet.
No.
Well, this has been really informative. Great concepts to adopt to our climate here, but that a lot of them are universal to a certain extent there, so we appreciate that.
Well, I hope I inspired you to do some of this kind of planting, and it can be at any scale. I mean, it can be just a small bed, or it can be a landscape around one side of your house, or, it doesn't have to be a huge garden like I have. Well, mine isn't even that huge, but
I liked especially 2 ideas that you had. One is planting the taller stuff in the north so that it doesn't shade everything. And then also to trim up so you can put edible things around the bottom. Those I'm going to implement right away. Those are helpful.
And
Thank you.
it's very conserving of space too, because you can have 2 trees very close together and one is tall and one is not as
Well,
tall.
we know how to pack it in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much for staying up late with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.